everyone. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, October 11th, where we are moving from Edgar Allan Poe to talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I also wanted to talk a little bit more about our upcoming paper. So the attendance question that I left you with was selecting a Poe quote that you thought had some relevance and to talk about some of the reasons why. So I'm very pleased with some of the quotes that you all chose. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. And I think what we got was a good overview of some of Poe's use of language, the way that he has literary elements, oftentimes poetic elements associated with his text, definitely uses Gothic atmosphere, and definitely delves into the psychological, something that we are also going to be talking about with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Of course, as you know, as a short story writer, Poe is different than a novelist. Usually a short story, well, obviously it's short. And I can't give you necessarily a specific number of pages as to what makes something a short story or a novella. But interestingly, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is viewed to be a novella. So it's longer than a short story, but not quite as long as a novel. So we would have had experience with all three lengths over the beginning course of this semester, since we began with Frankenstein, a novel, and then we moved to short story. And short story usually talks about a single incident. And then we go to a novella, which is somewhere in between. Again, longer than a short story, could talk about multiple incidents, but it doesn't have the depth or the complexity that you would usually find in a novel. And all three of these are possibilities for your first paper. So as you know, what I did was I selected an Emily Dickinson quote, actually, about one need not be a chamber to be haunted as a possibility for you to pursue in your writing assignment, whether you decided to talk about Frankenstein or you decided to talk about one, or I wouldn't do more than two, Poe short stories, or you decided to talk about Jekyll and Hyde. And the idea is that you would show how that quote is illustrated within the text that you happen to choose. So that said, there are a good number of psychological elements in Frankenstein and Poe and ultimately Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that you could pursue if you wanted to talk about the idea of being haunted. Though, of course, we could talk about literal hauntings as well. But at this point, we haven't gotten to texts that would be firmly representative of the supernatural. We are going to have to wait until we get to some of the texts that are later on in the semester. And even something like Dracula, as we will see, which is more often than not viewed as firmly embedded in the supernatural. When we read the tale, we'll see how it's told through the epistolary novel technique, through letters and journals and so forth. And at the very ending, the acknowledgement that outside of a lot of first-person documentation and some newspaper clippings, there's no way to verify the authenticity of their tale, which is something that we've also talked about. That is a criteria in Gothic literature. It often comes with a certain level of ambiguity. Many of you had talked a little bit about that in terms of Poe's short stories, and that we could take a psychological interpretation, but we can also take a supernatural interpretation, as I was suggesting to several of you. In fact, I like the idea of the duality, and especially because duality is such a major theme in the Gothic, but that both possibilities, so we could have a supernatural beating heart, but it could also be the beating heart of the narrator as well. And, of course, when we're talking about Edgar Allan Poe, one of the things we oftentimes talk about is narration. Perhaps his most famous line is about "True, dreadfully nervous I am." How often he gives us the first-person narrator who happens to be racked by guilt. How often it is that he uses symbols such as eyes, for instance, or cats. And that would be particularly applicable to the black cat and all of the superstitions, mostly negative, though there are some positive ones, associated with cat. Many of you had talked about the brutality of Something in the Black Cat. Probably out of all of the stories, that's the story that I think most readers find to be disturbing, because of the references to animal brutality. And I know that I personally, when I'm watching a film, I'm not usually too upset if I see a human being in danger, but I'm very upset if I see an animal in danger. And I think I'm not alone in terms of sharing that particular experience. So, that said, the idea of all of these short stories that I chose with Poe, and there were only four, was to try to give you a little bit of a taste of some of his writing and how his writing has influenced other writers, Stephen King in particular. So if you are familiar with The Shining, then you know that there are several references to Unmask, which is part of The Mask of Red Death. As many of you talked about some of the parallels now that exist in terms of COVID and some of the isolation we had to undergo. Note there's usually a moral element in Poe's stories. So even something like, let's say, The Fall of the House of Usher, what's implied, it's never directly stated, is that there is a generational evil, probably incestual, not surprising in terms of being able to keep bloodlines within particular family branches, which would have been expected in the 1800s, and the consequences of that. So, as always, I encourage you to read the discussion forum responses, but especially now for Edgar Allan Poe, if you haven't already done so, because this will give you a good idea of many of the quotes that have particular relevance when it comes to Poe. So then I move forward and talk a little bit about writing papers and also Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So my hope is that you've begun reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We've got multiple classes associated with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So we can talk about the text, we can watch performance, and we can also devote some time to actually writing the papers. I was able to find a free link for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde through Project Gutenberg, so you'll see that in the notes below. And just in terms of introducing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to talk about the third section in the notes below, about 1800 society, Victorian society, which was definitely known for its repression, particularly its sexual repression. It was all about the importance of decorum and appearance. This will be important in terms of understanding Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Darwinism and the idea of perhaps not just necessarily progression, but regression. And I think you will see that when we also talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Jack the Ripper. And this appeared 2 years after the novel, a serial killer that basically was targeting prostitutes in London. There are enough similarities, however, between that and the tale Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that it oftentimes is wondered whether or not the tale helped to inspire the murderer. And in fact, there were even some productions that were done on stage in Jekyll and Hyde where ultimately the actor was identified, the actor playing Dr. Jekyll and also Mr. Hyde, it was identified as a possible suspect for Jack the Ripper. And then, of course, we've got Freud, and I wanted to talk about Freud a little bit more as the next few classes develop. But basically, Freud talked about the id, the ego, and the superego, the three elements of personality. The id being the bestial, and the superego being conscience, and the ego trying to balance the two. Certainly, that's also going to be something that's important in Jekyll and Hyde. And you'll see that I've even included a video below from YouTube. It's approximately 13 minutes or so that gives you a little bit of background about the novel that I encourage you to watch. Stevenson was a Scottish novelist. You probably know him through perhaps his most famous work, Treasure Island. And of course, we're reading the novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Usually people call it Jekyll and Hyde, but the novel in its entirety, or the title in its entirety, is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, almost reminding me of how Frankenstein is not necessarily the title in its entirety. It's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And some of the themes you can expect as you're reading Jekyll and Hyde is talking about repression, talking about socioeconomic class. It was very much a time with huge class distinctions. You could say that perhaps the same exists today with huge class distinctions between the very wealthy and the very poor. Definitely, there is reference to the idea of drug use and abuse. Definitely, there's references to, as I had indicated earlier, Darwinism. And definitely, there is this idea of doubling or the doppelganger, which is something that we've talked about as being an element of the Gothic. So, movie adaptations for Jekyll and Hyde have oftentimes taken great textual liberties, oftentimes providing a heterosexual relationship that doesn't exist within the text itself. And this is going to also be important for our analysis. And in fact, some have even suggested, and the video talks a little bit about this as well, that the subtext in the novel or the novella is really about not just sexual repression, but specifically queerness. And that's something that we will be discussing as well when we read Jekyll and Hyde. Probably you know the term Jekyll and Hyde because it's been used in popular culture. We usually references to somebody that has two very distinct sides to their personality. And if you're curious about how it's been used in popular culture, I have a 10-minute video in the 7th section of notes below that you might want to watch. It's an old Bugs Bunny cartoon, Hyde and Hare. And actually, it was my first introduction to the Jekyll and Hyde myth. If nothing else, it's entertaining. And Jekyll and Hyde has been embraced by popular culture and entertainment. You'll see that there is a New York City club. It's one of those theme restaurants that's called the Jekyll and Hyde Club, and I've included the link there if you wanted to see it. I haven't been in years. The last time I was there, though, it was quite the experience, where basically they tried to duplicate a lab with the mad scientists on the run, and the servers were dressed as various Hollywood monsters, and there were screens everywhere that would play classic monster movies. There was a bar that would have its seats that would slowly raise and lower so that you would be disoriented, particularly after you had a few drinks. So it was quite the experience. The food was mediocre, I'm the first to admit it, but you didn't go to the Jekyll and Hyde Club for the food. You went for the atmosphere. But again, the video that I encourage you to watch is about the bizarre truth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's 13 minutes long. As you can see, it's in the 8th section in the notes below. That'll give you a little bit of background. I know that you might be in different places right now with your reading, but I wanted to at least introduce Jekyll and Hyde to you because it is a possibility for the first paper, which I have scheduled as due on the 25th-ish. What that means is that the 25th is approximately midway through the semester. So I'm hopeful that by that point you would have submitted in a paper. But certainly there's a little bit of flexibility here, but I'm starting to honestly get anxious if you've gone midway through the semester, you haven't handed in an assignment. And everybody has the option of rewriting this paper. So once you've submitted it, I will evaluate it for grammar and mechanics, as well as for content, and put a letter grade on it. If you're satisfied with the grade, then you're done with the assignment. But if you wanted to improve your grade, you could incorporate my comments. And then if you're still uncertain as to how to proceed, reach out to me. And I ask that you submit in your revision along with the original graded copy with my comments so I can compare and contrast the two. And then you would get the higher of the two grades. So I see the first paper is a kind of learning exercise, and your second paper will be due at the very ending of the semester. So chances are you wouldn't have the opportunity to rewrite it. But as you know, I have rolling deadlines, so that if you could get in your second paper early enough, there might be the possibility of revision, but it's not guaranteed. It's something we would have to negotiate. Certainly it's something that is guaranteed to everyone for the first paper. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to submit that paper, though that revision, if you chose to write a revision of paper number 1. But the sooner the better for everybody involved, obviously. And in terms of the paper, you can see that in the beginning of our notes, section 1, I've got some elements about writing papers, and I included a handout that actually was distributed to me when I was a college student many years ago that I think is still quite useful in terms of how to construct the paper. And it is in the syllabus and other documents folder, and I encourage you to read it. Though I'm well aware that you've probably talked about the conventions of writing a paper and other English classes as well. But basically, just to summarize, there are three elements: planning, writing, editing. And most students, as I've said many times, go straight to the writing and try to write the perfect first sentence and waste a lot of time rather than spending time with the planning. So I'm hopeful now that you are all in the planning stage and you're thinking about what could I write about. That said, I understand that you might decide to write about Jekyll and Hyde and you may not necessarily have finished reading it yet, but hopefully you'll finish it sooner rather than later. And then the beautiful thing about planning is that all of the note-taking and ideas that you come up with are for your eyes only. They don't have to be correct. They don't have to be written in any particular form or format. And then if you start early enough, you can go back to it after the fact and eliminate things and add things. So then you can begin the writing phase, which is where you begin to construct what looks like a paper. And that you've got sentences and paragraphs, but you don't need to worry about polishing those sentences and paragraphs. The idea is just to get the organization down so that ultimately you can go to the editing phase, which is the last phase of writing a paper. And then you can focus on trying to rephrase these sentences so that they are as concise and clear as possible. I had a very wise professor in college once say that a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. And I highly agree with that. And that you could continue to work on a paper forever, but you want to try to spend as much time on it as possible so that you can really devote some time to the editing phase. Again, most writers skip the editing phase, frankly, because they've run out of time and energy. So you want to save some time for that. And just in terms of the basics of writing a paper, you've got an introductory paragraph. And that introductory paragraph is where you give your thesis, your main point of your paper. You may not know what the main point of your paper is until you're done writing it. So you might actually have to write the thesis after the fact. In fact, you can even read the paragraphs that you've written, summarize them in one or two sentences, and put that in your opening as your thesis, so you can work backwards. I've done that myself. And in the opening paragraph is where you give the name of the author and the text that you happen to be writing about. This is also where I would suspect that you would give the Emily Dickinson quote and talk about how it's applicable to the text that you've chosen. But keep in mind, this is merely a suggestion, not a requirement. You can come up with your own paper topic. Just make sure that you have the topic approved by me, and that means that you've reached out to me and I've given you permission to be able to write on that particular topic. But think about all of the things that we've already discussed. For instance, a comparing and contrasting between Victor and the creature in Frankenstein would make a great paper. Talking about their similarities and their differences. And they really are more similar than different in many respects. Like father, like son, I suppose, if you wanted to think about that parallel. Then you've got body paragraphs. And your body paragraphs are where you give your evidence and your details. Basically, you're almost like an attorney. You're gathering together information to present a kind of courtroom case. So you're picking and choosing the pieces of evidence that will best suit your position. A good attorney can argue either side, either prosecution or defense, with the same pieces of evidence. They're just highlighting different pieces. So in theory, you should be able to write a paper that takes multiple positions that, or you should be able to write multiple papers, I should say, that take multiple positions that sometimes even contradict one another. And all of those could be excellent papers. The idea is that ultimately you're going to choose one position and support that. And if we wanted to continue on with this comparison, I guess you could say I'm the judge. I'm supposed to remain neutral. And based on the pieces of evidence that you've put together, then make a decision as to whether or not the argument is possible. And what you would be doing is probably using some quotation, direct language from the text itself, as well as using some paraphrase, putting it in your own language. Do note that a paragraph is a developed idea. It is minimum 3 sentences with a beginning, middle, and end. Probably a lot longer. And I know that the media writes different kinds of paragraphs. For instance, journalism, but we're talking about academic writing, which is basically the writing of the expectations of not only college classes but also the workplace as well. So that's how you can transfer those skills over. So usually, if something is well written, that first sentence is known as a topic sentence. And that first sentence in your paragraph oftentimes summarizes what the paragraph is about. So, not that every paragraph has to do this, but if something is well written, you can go through the first sentences of all of your paragraphs and have an outline. And I realize that, again, this is mostly review, and I've talked about some of these elements before, but I'm at the point now in the semester where I'm hopeful that you are beginning to actually do some writing. And then, of course, you have the concluding paragraph, and that gives a sense of closure. And you're not adding any new ideas. You're basically trying to find a way to satisfactorily let the reader know that you're coming to an end. Perhaps you can relate to, or perhaps you can discuss a related work by the same author, or perhaps you can relate what you're talking about to contemporary times, or you can even restate what you did in your introduction, but you don't want to repeat exactly what you've done in your introduction. So those are the basics in terms of writing a paper. And in terms of documentation, we use the MLA system, the Modern Language Association system of parenthetical documentation. This is the system you use in the humanities, that includes English classes. There are different systems for the sciences. So, for instance, the APA system, the American Psychological Association, is what we use for the sciences. So you don't want to mix up the systems. You're using the MLA for our purposes. And what this means is that you use parentheses immediately following a direct quote. And it doesn't matter if you've ended your sentence or not. And then within those parentheses, you put the least amount of information necessary for the reader to be able to determine where that quote comes from. And you can see that in the notes below in the second section, I've given you some examples. That punctuation comes after the parenthetical documentation. So a quote such as, Krebs went to war from a Methodist college, close your quotation marks, open the parentheses, indicate the page number, in this instance 162, close parentheses, and then you put your ending quote. Notice you don't have to write the word page, PG, or anything inside the parentheses. Usually the least amount of information that we need to include in the parentheses is the page number. However, you may need to add additional pieces of information if you're using multiple texts. So you may need to include, for instance, the author's last name along with the page number if it turns out that you are referring to several texts by the same author. Or let's say it also is, if you're referring to several texts by the same author, you probably have to also include part of the name of the text in addition to the author. But if it's unclear which author you are referencing because you're using multiple authors in your paper, then you would probably have to give the author's surname in the parentheses along with the page number. If it's clear what text you're referring to, then you can just do the page number. So you just continue to add layers. And again, I'm well aware that you probably talked about this in Comp 1 and Comp 2. So you continue to add layers inside of the parentheses to give the reader enough information as to where you got that particular piece of information from. And if you're not done with your sentence, don't put an ending punctuation, just continue your sentence. And then you can end it, which is the example I've given you. Sentence continuation after documentation. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. Then we have parentheses, 162, close parentheses. And then I continue on with my sentence. He cannot pray with his mother, period. Now, sometimes you can insert something into a quote, and that would usually be to clarify something. Let's say a pronoun, for instance, to clarify the particular character that's being referenced, that it might be unclear based on the quote that you've decided to select. So I've given you an example of that. Again, in the second section of the notes below, if you're going to insert, quote, even his, and then I have square brackets, not parentheses, square brackets. Within those square brackets, I've included a name, Krebs. Crabs is in relation to the pronoun his. So that's the character that I'm referencing. Based on the quote, even his lies were not sensational. It could be unclear which character I'm talking about in this particular story. So I've decided to insert myself into the quote. Not to add commentary, that I can do before or after the quote. But if something needs to immediately be clarified, I can insert square brackets, and that's the reader's cue that anything in those square brackets was not part of the original quote. It was basically my addition. And then you can see I continue on with my quote, and then I have my parentheses, page number, close parentheses, ending quote. I can also omit something from a quote, not because I want to change the meaning of a quote, that would be unethical, but because basically it's something that's not relevant. So you get to decide where to start a quote, and you get to decide where to end the quote. You can start a quote mid-sentence, you can end a quote in mid-sentence. But between the start and stop points, you might leave out a word or several words just because it's not relevant. And if that's the case, you can see that in the example below under omission. We use something called an ellipsis, and that is 3 periods or 3 dots. And if you ever see that in the middle of a quote, that means a word or several words were left out of the original quote. Again, you don't have to begin or end the quote with an ellipsis because the assumption is that text came before the quote, text came after the quote. But in between your start and stop point, you can add an ellipsis to indicate this was not the quote in its entirety. You've left out a word or several words. And basically what you're doing is you're providing the reader with enough information so they can verify that you are quoting accurately. So again, the least amount of information in the parentheses. And then the way all of this comes together is that you have a works cited page at the very ending of your writing, which lists all of the works that you've cited or quoted from. All of the books and websites and magazine articles and so forth. And they're all listed by author's last name and then the author's first name and then the name of the text. And there's slight differences in terms of how you would reference a book as opposed to a magazine article as opposed to a website. And basically there are a series of rules that you follow, and if you utilize these often enough, you just end up memorizing them just by happenstance, but you're not really required to memorize this. You look it up, and it's almost like a cookbook. That's what I liken it to, is that you just follow the directions exactly. So if they give you an example of how you quote from a newspaper, then that's exactly how you do it in your works cited page. You put the commas where they tell you to, and the parentheses where they tell you to, and the periods where they tell you to. And again, there'll be some slight differences with referencing something like a website, for instance. Now, the good news is that, or perhaps this is good news, is that we aren't writing a research paper. So you're not using outside sources. I'm having you write a critical paper, which means you're focusing on your own analysis, your own interpretation, and what you've learned in class and from your classmates. So you don't need to use outside sources. So this simplifies things in terms of documentation. At this point, it seems like the only thing you would be documenting is the actual text itself that you're analyzing, whether it be Frankenstein or a Poe short story or perhaps Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which you would indicate in your opening paragraph. So if that's the case, you don't really need to hand in a works cited page. Technically, you should. And if you want to, you certainly can if you want the practice of doing it. But you would all be citing the same text that basically I ordered for class. And I'm assuming that you've already done this in previous classes, so you wouldn't need to do that. So that said, you can dispense with the works cited page if you don't want to include that. But you do need to make sure that you're using your parenthetical documentation within the actual paper itself. And a couple of websites that I can recommend to you that talk about all of this in greater depth. The first being Purdue OWL, which you might have heard of before, and you can see that in the second section. I've included that website, and it's from Purdue University. It talks about the entire process of writing a paper, from brainstorming ideas to editing it and the formatting for submitting it in, which I talked briefly about on our syllabus, that it should be typed in double space with 1-inch margins. It should also have a cover page, which is just a separate sheet of paper with your name, my name, the title, the due date. Again, that's on our syllabus. And in terms of Purdue OWL, they've made their site accessible to the public, so you don't need to be a student at Purdue. So it's a wonderful resource. But keep in mind, a lot of times people forget this, that another wonderful resource is the GCC library. And the GCC library is quite aware that you are writing papers at GCC. And I've included the link to their writing and citation guides, where they review how to use the MLA and the APA, and they go through everything that I've talked about much more in depth as well. So that if you wanted to brush up on it, certainly you could reference either one of those two sites. And I'll talk a little bit more about the conventions of writing a paper as the semester progresses. Again, I encourage you to review the handout that I've included in the syllabus and other documents folder about writing the critical paper, a handout that was given to me when I was a college student that I've saved all these years. And it does, I think, really do a nice job of sort of explaining the 3 steps of planning and then writing and then editing, as well as some of the conventions associated with writing that I'll be talking about next class as well, just as a kind of review. Again, I'm aware that you've probably had experience with this, but I wanted to stop here so that you could watch that brief video about the bizarre truth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And if it turns out that you wanted to watch the Bugs Bunny hide and hair, you can also do that as well. So we will continue on next class talking about Jekyll and Hyde and writing papers, and the attendance question for today, which would be due on Friday the 13th. The date doesn't escape me here. Did you know anything about Jekyll and Hyde prior to this course? And if so, what did you know? I'm just kind of curious to see. I know that Frankenstein is iconic, and in some ways so is Poe. Jekyll and Hyde perhaps less so. So this is a question that you can ask that not only doesn't have a right or wrong answer, but this is a question, too, that you can respond to if you haven't really gotten deep into the text. At this point, I'm hopeful that you've finished Frankenstein, you've finished Poe, you're in the midst of Jekyll and Hyde, and you're thinking about your first paper. But we will continue on next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I hope you had a good day off on Monday. It was Monday, wasn't it? Yes, it was. It was Monday. And that's it. We'll continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.